Captain Jack and the crew embark on their most perilous quest yet, seeking the legendary chart of the Storm King, said to command the fury of the sea itself. Battling vengeful spirits, rival captains, and a monstrous Leviathan, Jack discovers that power comes with an unforgiving price. As the sea tests his resolve, Jack must decide, will he master the ocean's might or become its next sacrifice? Can he lead his crew through dangers that transcend life and death, or will the sea's curse claim them all? The moon rode high on its silver chariot, casting a jagged path of light across the heaving sea. The Amber Dagger sliced through the dark water, its sails straining as wind surged like a ghostly whisper. Captain Jack stood at the helm, his hazel eyes scanning the waves as if daring them to challenge him. He was a legend among the Caribbean's most cunning, a man who had danced with fate and come out laughing. Yet tonight, the laugh stayed hidden, replaced by the silent edge of curiosity. "Captain!" A shout cut through the rush of wind. "Something drifts starboard!" The crew of medium brown-skinned rogues, eyes sharp and movements practiced, crowded the rail. A wooden shape bobbed amid the black foam, thumping against the hull. In the light of the lanterns, it revealed itself. A bottle sealed with a cracked black wax, half submerged and rattling like an omen. "Bring it up!" Jack's command cracked like a whip, urgency flaring as the deckhands pulled it aboard. Seawater streamed from the ancient glass, glistening as he pried the seal loose. Within lay a map fragment, etched in what seemed more carved than drawn, lines searing into the yellowed paper like a storm unleashed by quill and lightning. An unreadable note lay underneath, but Jack needed no written lore. He knew this tale by heart, the chart of the Storm King, a relic whispered to summon the maelstrom which could sink armadas or crown its holder as ruler of the waves. "Looks cursed, Captain," muttered Drake, his right-hand man with a jaw as sharp as his temper. Jack smirked, though the unease settled deep in his gut. "It's the cursed ones that are worth the chase, mate." Lightning forked the horizon in response, illuminating the heavens with a flash that revealed something darker, a ship-shaped shadow lurking at the edge of sight. The men looked back nervously as clouds devoured the moon. "Helm! Due north!" Jack barked, and the ship creaked as she heaved onto a new course, wind roaring in protest. But Jack's eyes stayed fixed ahead, teeth clenched against the rising storm that felt too sudden, too alive. Far behind, a second set of sails caught the moon's glare. The Serpent's Maw, commanded by Captain Drake, Jack's sworn rival, infamous for his pursuit of vengeance sharper than a reef's edge. Word had already spread of Jack's find, though no mouth had uttered it. The sea had her own way of carrying secrets. As the Amber Dagger cut deeper into the night, the sea began to hum, low and foreboding. An unseen choir sang a mournful shanty that echoed in the salt-thickened air, a harbinger that the Storm King was stirring from his slumber. The pirate ship surged north, slicing through the ink-black waves as if hunted by the very wind that filled her sails. The sea churned with a strange, whispering pulse, as if an ancient heart beat beneath the foam. Captain Jack kept his gaze forward, his jaw set with a determination that crackled through his crew like a silent storm. "Captain," came a voice laced with nerves. It was Marta, the ship's quartermaster, her hair tied back with a strip of worn red cloth. She had the steady hands of a helmsman and eyes that had stared down storms. "We're not alone out here." Before Jack could respond, a flash of lightning etched the world in sharp relief. To starboard, barely a breath away, the Serpent's Maw crept into view, her black sails bloated with a ghostly wind. At her prow stood Captain Drake, his silhouette unmistakable, tall, imposing, with eyes that seemed to drink the dark. His voice rolled across the waves, thick as tar. "Jack, that map is mine, and you know it." Drake's laugh followed, bitter as brine. "Hand it over, or I'll sink you and your crew to the abyss where the Storm King waits." Jack's fingers clenched around the chart as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the deck. "Sink us?" he muttered under his breath, a smirk curving his lips. "He'll have to do better than that." "Raise the colors," he shouted. The Amber Dagger's flag, a crimson cutlass crossed with a skeletal compass, fluttered defiantly. The crew sprang to life, their muscles rippling with the urgency of the fight to come. Cannons boomed from the Serpent's Maw, their roar ripping through the night, sending bursts of fire and smoke belching into the wind. The Amber Dagger lurched as wood splintered, and a deckhand cried out, gripping his arm where a shard had pierced through. The sea boiled with the shock of the blast, and screams mingled with the crash of waves. "Return fire!" Marta's voice rang out, clear as a bell slicing through chaos. The ship's starboard cannons erupted in answer, spitting flame and iron. The night shattered as cannonballs splashed into the side of Drake's ship, sending a spray of seawater and splintered timber flying into the air. Yet, through the smoke, Drake's grin remained visible, a dark promise. "Captain, look there," Drake called, pointing past the serpent's maw to where the horizon writhed unnaturally. It was no ordinary storm. A cyclone of clouds twisted above the sea, black tendrils stretching down like the fingers of an old, vengeful god. "The maelstrom," Jack whispered. His grip on the chart tightened as a shiver raced down his spine. This wasn't just a storm. It was the Storm King's domain, awakened and hungry. A sudden lurch nearly sent Jack to his knees. The sea beneath them rumbled with a voice older than any tale told in rum-soaked taverns. From its depths, a mournful chanty grew louder, words in no known tongue echoing as if sung by drowned sailors. "Get us away from that," Marta shouted, her voice strained, eyes wide as the unnatural winds lashed at her. But the sea seemed determined to drag them in, clawing at the Amber Dagger with frothing hands. "Brace yourselves," Jack shouted. The world tilted as the ship lurched towards the edge of the storm, where the sea churned in spirals. Waves swirled into the sky, defying nature's laws as the ship teetered on the lip of the watery abyss. The cries of the crew fell silent, swallowed by the roar of the maelstrom. And then, just as suddenly, silence. The winds stopped. The sea calmed, leaving the Amber Dagger caught in an eerie eye of stillness. The crew exchanged nervous glances, sweat tracing lines down their grimy faces. "Jack," Marta's voice trembled, and Jack followed her gaze. Out of the swirling dark mist, forms began to appear. Men in tattered uniforms, their eyes blazing with an ethereal blue light. The crew of the Iron Teeth, the Storm King's eternal guard, had come to claim what was theirs. Before Jack could issue a command, a spectral captain emerged at their head. His form was translucent yet solid enough that the weight of his presence pressed down on them all. The ghost raised a rusted, barnacle-encrusted cutlass and pointed it at Jack. "Return what belongs to the storm, or face the wrath of the drowned." The crew froze, hearts pounding in their chests. Drake's ship lingered at the edge of the whirlpool, its captain's laughter ringing out again. Confident, sharp as a knife, he had his own plan, and it was about to unfold. The ghostly captain's eyes glowed with the cold fire of forgotten depths. His voice, hollow and thunderous, rippled across the deck of the Amber Dagger as if summoned from the bottom of the sea. Jack stood motionless, his breath caught between defiance and fear, as the spectral figures advanced, their forms wavering like mist, but eyes locked with lethal intent. "Return the chart, or become a relic of the deep," the captain repeated, his barnacle-encrusted cutlass quivering with an unnatural gleam. Jack's mind raced. His crew shifted, glancing at him for orders that would either seal their fate or save their lives. Marta's hands tightened around her sword hilt, her jaw clenched against the rising tremor in her chest. Drake's eyes darted from the spectral enemies to the jagged shadow of the serpent's maw, where Captain Drake watched with an expression both mocking and eager. Drake's voice sliced through the silence. "Look at you, Jack. Haunted by the dead, surrounded by the living who would see you fail. What will it be? Surrender, or shall I watch as these ghosts drag you under?" Jack's eyes flicked to the chart in his hand. The etched lines seemed to pulse as if alive, as though the Storm King himself whispered through it. With a sharp intake of breath, he folded the map and slid it into his coat. He couldn't relinquish it. Not now, not ever. "Not today, Drake," he muttered. He raised his voice, steel cold. "Crew, hold fast. We fight on my word." The spectral captain's lip curled in a snarl, and he surged forward, his translucent crew following like a tide. The clash was chaos incarnate. Ghostly swords met steel, and the chill of the spectral weapons burned worse than flame. Men shouted as spectral forms swirled around them, cutting through flesh with a searing cold that left no mark but sapped strength with each touch. Drake swung his cutlass at a specter that lunged, its mouth gaping with silent rage. The blade met resistance as if cutting through fog thick as chains, and the ghost vanished with a shriek, only to reform moments later. The crew fought with the ferocity of cornered wolves, but the dead held no fear, no pain. Marta leapt back from a ghostly swing, eyes wide as the wind around her turned sharp and cold. "Captain, we can't last against this." Her voice shook with urgency. Jack's gaze snapped to the edge of the maelstrom. It twisted wider, hungrier, as if sensing victory. With every passing moment, the ship's timbers groaned under an invisible weight, pulling them toward the abyss. The Amber Dagger bucked as if alive, fighting against the grasp of the supernatural storm. "Helmsman, turn her hard to port," Jack commanded, eyes blazing. "We'll use the current to our advantage." The crew barely had time to react before the ship tilted into a wild arc. The whirlpool's edge pulled them along with ferocious speed, dragging their pursuers with them. Spectral figures stumbled, their forms flickering as the sudden movement disoriented them. Drake, watching from the safety of the serpent's maw, realized too late what Jack intended. His eyes widened as the Amber Dagger swept into the current, creating a wake that sent a surge of churning water toward his ship. "No!" he roared, spinning to his crew. "Steady her! Steady or we're doomed!" The momentary reprieve bought Jack precious seconds. He pulled the chart from his coat and pressed it to the rail. The ink shimmered, responding to the proximity of the maelstrom. Words hidden in the jagged lines appeared, ancient, unreadable but pulsing with purpose. Marta's eyes met Jack's, her fear giving way to the gleam of realization. "Captain, what does it say?" Jack's smirk was feral. "It says we have a choice." But before he could act, a ghostly blade sank into the rail beside him. The spectral captain appeared, eyes blazing. "There is no choice, mortal. The power you seek binds you to the storm." Suddenly the world froze, as if the sea itself held its breath. The air thickened, and a voice, low and resonant, swept through the deck. A voice not of the dead but of the storm itself. "Return or command. The sea will take its toll." Time snapped back and the whirlpool shrieked as water rushed in. Drake's ship, caught in the backwash of Jack's maneuver, veered wildly, its crew screaming as waves swallowed the starboard side. Jack met the specter's eyes, defiance carved into his features. "I choose," he whispered, gripping the chart. He slammed his fist down, activating the runes with his will alone. The maelstrom convulsed, sending out a shockwave that knocked every ghostly figure back into the dark. Drake's ship lurched, splintered, and disappeared beneath the crashing sea. Silence followed, broken only by the gasps of Jack's crew as they steadied themselves. The storm calmed, the night sky split with dawn's fragile light. But in the breeze that whispered past, a word lingered, full of promise and warning. "Chosen." Jack staggered, the weight of victory sinking in, but so did the cost. Somewhere in the distance, the specter's eyes still burned, waiting. The dawn painted the sea in streaks of gold and crimson, a deceptive calm after the night's battle. The Amber Dagger drifted in exhausted silence, her sails limp, her deck slick with seawater and the sweat of men who had glimpsed their end and somehow survived. Jack stood at the prow, his heart still pounding with the echo of the storm's command. "Chosen." The word hummed in his bones like a haunting refrain. Marta approached, her boots squelching on the sodden wood. Her dark eyes were sharp, searching his face for the answer to an unasked question. "Captain, we fought the ghosts and won, but what price did we pay?" Her voice was steady, but the worry in it cut deeper than a blade. Jack's lips pressed into a thin line. The chart felt heavier now, as if the ink held the weight of tides yet to come. He glanced at the sea, where the maelstrom's violence had faded to gentle swells. No trace of the serpent's maw remained, yet he knew Drake was not the type to be silenced so easily. Not even by the storm. "The price is still to be paid," he replied, the words sour in his mouth. He glanced back at his weary crew. Some were slumped against the rails, eyes glazed with disbelief, while others muttered prayers of thanks to gods they hadn't thought of in years. But beneath their relief, an unease simmered. Jack felt it in the air, a charge that promised the battle was far from over. A sudden splash jarred the crew to attention. From the calm waves, a figure rose, gripping the ragged remains of a splintered beam. Water poured from Drake's battered frame, his dark hair plastered against a face twisted with rage. He hauled himself aboard, a ghost risen from the sea's depths. "You think a storm can kill me, Jack?" Drake spat, his voice hoarse but strong. His eyes, sharp as obsidian, locked onto Jack with a hatred that seemed to crackle between them like lightning. "Drake," Marta gasped, drawing her sword. The rest of the crew, though worn to their cores, scrambled to their feet, weapons raised, eyes flicking to their captain for direction. Jack stepped forward, the chart clutched in his hand. "You survived the storm, but you won't survive this ship," he said, voice cold as the ocean's depths. Drake's lips curled into a half smile, and he raised an empty hand. "Ah, but I've brought company." A chill swept across the deck as spectral figures began to coalesce from the morning mist. They took shape slowly, first translucent, then solidifying until the ghostly crew of the Iron Teeth stood, eyes burning with the blue fire of the cursed. The crew of the Amber Dagger stepped back, murmurs of disbelief breaking into shouts of alarm. "Hold the line!" Marta barked, her voice fierce. But it was too late. The specters moved with the fury of the storm that had birthed them, their rusted blades slicing through air and leaving trails of ghostly frost in their wake. Jack met Drake's eyes over the chaos. Realizing the true depth of his rival's ambition, Drake had not only survived the storm, he had claimed allegiance with the dead. "You've chained yourself to the Storm King's crew," Jack shouted. "You're mad." "Mad?" Drake's laughter rang out, hollow and harsh. "No, Jack, I'm chosen just as you are. But while you flinch at the power, I'll wield it." He lunged, a cutlass in hand, eyes aflame with desperation and triumph. The two captains clashed, steel meeting with a ring that seemed to reverberate into the very marrow of the crew. The ghosts surged around them, spectral chains clattering as they wrapped around sailors' limbs, pulling them into the dark. Marta fought alongside Drake, their blades darting and deflecting strikes with practiced precision. Yet, even as they repelled the spirits, their forms wavered, reforming faster than wounds could be inflicted. A scream rose from the aft, where a young deckhand fell, eyes wide as a specter's sword swept through him, leaving no blood but a lifeless, unmoving shell. "Jack!" Marta's shout turned his attention just in time. Drake's blade came down, and Jack pivoted, narrowly avoiding the strike. The chart crumpled in his fist, burned like ice. A sudden realization dawned on him. The chart wasn't just a guide, it was a key, a weapon if he could only decipher its ancient call. "Enough!" Jack roared, lifting the chart above his head. It shimmered, light spilling like liquid from the runes. The ghosts paused, their eyes fixed on the glow, an expression of longing or dread flickering across their faces. Drake faltered, eyes narrowing as the tides of the battle shifted in an instant. "What are you doing, Jack?" he demanded, the confidence draining from his voice. "Commanding what you only sought to steal." Jack's voice carried the weight of a storm. He focused on the runes, letting their meaning slip into his mind. A whisper that turned into a roar. He spoke the word, a guttural, forgotten language that resonated with the very sea. The ghosts wailed, their forms shivering as if the chains binding them shattered in an unseen explosion. One by one they dissipated, their blue fire dimming into nothingness. Drake, eyes wide with disbelief, dropped his sword, the last fight within him quenching like a flame underwater. "No, this isn't over," he rasped, as spectral hands pulled at him, dragging him back toward the sea. "You may have the chart, but the sea never forgets." Jack watched as Drake was swallowed by the mist, the words echoing in his ears. The dawn returned, serene yet chilling, as the last ghost vanished. The crew stood in stunned silence, their chests heaving with relief and exhaustion. Marta stepped forward, sweat streaked with salt, a rare grin breaking the tension. "Captain, we're still here. The sea may not forget, but neither will we." Jack let out a breath, the weight in his hand suddenly light. "Aye, but this is far from over." He glanced at the horizon where storm clouds still lingered, dark as omens. In the distance, a shadow moved, something watching from the unseen depths. The sea held its secrets, and with the chart in hand, Jack knew he had only begun to unravel them. The calm that followed the battle was deceptive, a silence that pressed on the ears as if waiting for the world to exhale. The crew of the Amber Dagger moved about in a stunned daze, tending to the wounded and eyeing the horizon with the wariness of men who had glimpsed the edge of the abyss and survived. Jack stood at the helm, fingers tracing the worn edges of the chart, now glowing with a pulse that matched his heartbeat. "Captain," Marta called softly. She approached, wiping sweat and seawater from her brow. The cutlass at her hip still bore the spectral chill from their recent battle. "What now? We're not going to tempt that storm again, are we?" Jack's eyes, still fierce from the fight, met hers. The chart hummed beneath his touch, each rune throbbing as if alive. "We're not tempting the storm," he said, his voice steady. "We're going to master it." A murmur rippled through the crew, a mix of awe and apprehension. The promise of power was enticing, but the memory of ghostly figures clawing at their ship was still fresh. Drake stepped forward, his broad shoulders tense, brows furrowed beneath salt-streaked hair. "Captain, I've followed you through storms, battles, and hunts that would scare a shark out of the water. But this feels different. What did you just do?" That word, it wasn't human. Jack's lips quirked in a half-smile. "No, Drake, it wasn't." He lifted the chart for all to see, the runes now glowing bright enough to cast long, wavering shadows on the deck. "This map isn't just a path to treasure. It's the Storm King's key, a command of the sea itself." A sharp intake of breath swept through the gathered crew. The tales of the Storm King were told in hushed voices, of a pirate who wielded storms and tides as weapons, and who had disappeared into legend after challenging the gods themselves. "But to what end, Captain?" Marta's voice was low, questioning. "What do we gain if it costs us everything?" Before Jack could answer, the air shifted. A whispering breeze curled around them, carrying a salt-stained voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "To command the sea is to hold life in one hand and death in the other. Choose or be chosen." The crew tensed, weapons raised against an unseen threat. Jack's hand gripped the chart tighter as a chill snaked up his spine. From the prow, a shape emerged, forming from the mist and sun-kissed spray. It was no longer just a ghost, but a figure carved from the sea itself, its face pale and shifting like moonlight on water. The eyes, dark and ageless, fixed on Jack with a knowing gaze. "I am the Storm King's will," it spoke, voice like a wave crashing over rocks. "You seek mastery of what only one dared and failed. Why should the sea obey you?" Jack's jaw set. He had faced death in 1,000 forms, but this was different. It was judgment. "Because I command it not for glory or greed, but to free it," he said, surprising even himself. The words resonated with truth, echoing from the depths of his heart where fear resided alongside ambition. The crew shifted behind him, eyes wide but now lit with something new. Belief. The being tilted its head, seaweed-like strands shifting. A slow, powerful wave rocked the ship, testing, pressing as if the sea itself weighed their worth. "And what price would you pay to wield such power?" the entity asked, voice now gentler, like a tide receding. Jack's gaze flicked to Marta, Drake, and the crew he had led through fire and wave. He knew the answer. It had been in the salt on his skin and the sting in his eyes ever since he had first set foot on a ship. "The sea claims all in the end, but if I am to be its steward, I would give up my claim to the land. I would bind my fate to the ocean's will." A silence settled, deeper than the stillness after a storm. The figure considered, then nodded once. The runes on the chart flared brilliantly, their light searing into Jack's eyes and mind until the horizon blurred into a vast expanse of silver and blue. The crew shielded their faces as the ship creaked, shuddered, and then, as if in acknowledgement, the waves lapped gently against the hull. "You are chosen," the entity whispered, before dissolving into the wind, leaving only the faintest scent of brine. Jack staggered, a strange clarity filling him. The chart no longer glowed. It rested cool and calm in his hand. Yet he felt the power coiled beneath the deck, a thrumming heartbeat of the sea. He turned to the crew, who now watched him with wide eyes and held breaths. "Set course," Jack said, his voice ringing out with a strength that resonated with something new, something ancient. "There are secrets yet to be claimed, and this time, the sea is ours." Marta exhaled a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Drake nodded, the shadow of doubt lifting as the crew moved with renewed purpose. Above them, the clouds scattered, the sky parting in a deep, victorious blue. But far below the surface, in the cold, dark heart of the ocean, a low, knowing rumble stirred. The true test was only beginning. The horizon stretched ahead, shimmering in a deceptive calm, the morning sun casting long, golden fingers across the endless expanse of blue. Yet beneath the serene surface, something ancient stirred. A silent warning whispered on the shifting tides. Jack stood at the helm, feeling the sea's heartbeat thrum through the wood of the Amber Dagger, an awareness that set his skin tingling. The chart had granted him mastery, but the sea's power was restless, a beast only barely leashed. "Captain, sighting ahead," shouted a lookout, his voice sharp with urgency. Jack squinted against the glare, and there, slicing through the mirage of water and light, was an island unlike any he'd seen before. Jagged black rocks jutted into the sky, forming spires that seemed to claw at the clouds, and a forest of twisted, silver-leafed trees whispered secrets to the wind. Marta appeared at his side, eyes narrowed with suspicion. "The Isle of Shadows," she muttered, crossing herself out of habit. "They say no pirate who set foot on it has ever returned." Jack's smile was tight. "Then it's long overdue for a visit." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, the name of the island enough to stir old sailors' tales of dark rituals, lost ships, and a god whose shadow held sway over its shores. But under Jack's command, doubt had no place. With a nod, he steered the ship closer, the rhythmic crash of waves echoing like a drumbeat against the hull. As the Amber Dagger dropped anchor, the tension crackled. Marta's fingers flexed over her cutlass, eyes scanning the shore for any movement, while Drake led a small group to prepare the landing boats. The forest loomed, whispering with voices that sounded too human to be wind alone. "Ready yourselves," Jack called, stepping into the lead boat. "Whatever haunts these shores, we face it together." The row to the beach was quiet, broken only by the dip of oars and the wheezing breath of sailors whose hands had known both plunder and prayer. When they stepped onto the black sand, it shifted underfoot, a subtle, slithering movement that made the hair on Jack's neck rise. "Captain," Drake whispered, pointing to a circle of stones half buried in the sand. They were inscribed with runes similar to those on the chart, each one cracked and weathered, as if scorched by an unseen fire. Jack knelt, tracing the grooves with a careful hand. The runes pulsed, responding to his touch, sending a shiver through the ground and up his spine. "Stay alert," Jack said, rising. "We're not alone." A rustle came from the trees, and out stepped a figure, tall and gaunt, wrapped in tattered robes of green that once might have been vibrant. His eyes, a milky, lifeless white, found Jack's, and he smiled, a grim, humorless stretch of skin. "So you come wielding the Storm King's key," the man said, his voice crackling like dry leaves. "Do you know what you've awoken, boy?" The crew bristled, hands going to swords, but Jack raised a hand. "I didn't come to listen to stories. Who are you and why do you haunt this place?" The man's laughter was harsh. "I am what remains of the priest who once served the one you now challenge. The sea is more than wind and wave, Captain. It remembers. And you," he pointed a bony finger at Jack, "are bound to its memory." Before Jack could respond, the ground trembled, and from the forest, shadows emerged, creatures twisted and wretched, their forms part human, part sea beast. Scales shimmered on their twisted limbs. Eyes glowed like the deep trenches of the ocean, and voices hummed with a song that pulled at the edges of sanity. "Back to the boats!" Marta shouted, slashing at one creature that leapt forward with a snarl. It screeched, falling back into the sand, leaving a wet, dark smear behind. Jack stood his ground, the chart crackling in his grip, the runes lit with a fierce glow, casting beams that pierced the thick forest air. The creatures hesitated, eyes narrowing against the light. The priest cackled, stepping back into the shadows. "You think you control the power, but it controls you, pirate. The sea always takes its due." "Enough of this," Jack muttered. He raised the chart high, speaking the word that had echoed in his mind since the maelstrom. "Korath." The air around him split with a crack that sent the creatures scrambling, howling as the light seared them into nothingness. Silence fell, heavy and sudden. The priest was gone, only the imprint of his mocking laughter left behind. Marta and Drake caught their breath. The remaining crew gathered close, eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. The island itself seemed to shift, the silver leaves of the trees now still as if in obeisance. "What now, Captain?" Marta asked, voice hushed. Jack lowered the chart, eyes fixed on the dark heart of the forest. The weight of the priest's warning sat cold in his chest, but he forced a grin. "Now we claim what's ours. The sea has given us the key. It's time we learn what it unlocks." With that, they stepped forward, deeper into the shadows where more than treasure waited. The path ahead promised power, but the price remained hidden, waiting to be named. The path through the forest seemed alive, shifting with every step, as if the island itself were a sentient creature observing their trespass. Jack led the crew, each man and woman straining to suppress the unease gnawing at their courage. The chart in Jack's hand thrummed like a heartbeat, guiding them toward the unknown. Twisted branches arched overhead, casting long skeletal shadows across their faces. The silence was so thick it seemed to muffle their very thoughts. "Captain, this place doesn't feel right," Drake muttered, eyes flicking to the shifting shapes in the underbrush. "It's like the forest is listening." "It probably is," Marta said, her voice hard as she swept her sword in an arc, clearing away vines that oozed a dark sap-like substance. "Keep your wits, lads." Suddenly, the trees parted to reveal a clearing dominated by a stone altar cracked and overgrown with dark moss. Strange carvings etched into its surface glowed with the same runes that marked the chart. At its center lay a chalice, silver and tarnished, its rim encrusted with deep green jewels that seemed to pulse with their own light. The air vibrated with a low hum that resonated in their chests. Jack approached cautiously, the chart in one hand, the other ready at his side. "This is it," he said, voice barely above a whisper. The power he sought shimmered just beyond reach, almost tangible now. Marta stepped beside him, eyes narrowing as the chalice glimmered. "What is it, Captain? Some kind of relic?" Jack nodded, the pieces clicking together in his mind. "The Cup of Tides," he said, awe mixing with the steel in his voice. "The Storm King's vessel of command. It's said to hold the very essence of the sea's power." Before anyone could respond, a sudden chill swept the clearing. The hum deepened, turning into a low, guttural growl that resonated through their bones. The shadows cast by the trees lengthened unnaturally, pooling around the altar like ink. The priest from before materialized again, his form wreathed in an eerie glow. This time, he was not alone. Spectral figures, their eyes alight with the cold fire of the drowned, emerged behind him. They were sailors, their forms twisted by the sea's embrace, mouths open in silent screams as they reached for the living. "You dare take what belongs to the sea?" the priest hissed, his voice a venomous wind. "The cup binds you, mortal. Command it and the sea commands you." The crew drew their swords, but Jack stood resolute, eyes blazing with defiance. "I've claimed it. The sea chose me," he shouted, lifting the chart, its runes flaring in defiance of the ghostly horde. The priest's laughter was sharp, grating against their nerves. "The sea's choice is a burden, not a blessing." With a gesture, the spectral sailors lunged forward, their ghostly limbs reaching out with the hunger of the forgotten. "Hold fast!" Marta shouted, slashing at the nearest spirit, her blade passing through it with a spray of icy mist. The creature shrieked, recoiling before surging back, unfazed. Drake's voice boomed. "Captain, we're surrounded." The battle erupted in a whirl of chaos. Swords clashed with nothing but air, yet each strike was met with resistance that chilled flesh and gnawed at resolve. Jack pressed forward, eyes locked on the chalice as the din of battle roared around him. The chart burned against his hand, its power a brand urging him on. "Korath!" Jack bellowed, the word ringing with an authority that silenced the clearing. The runes on the altar flared, casting a light that seared the air and pushed the spirits back with a wail. The priest staggered, eyes wide with something close to fear. "No!" he shrieked, lunging at Jack. But the captain was faster, his hand closing around the chalice. A pulse of energy surged through him, and the forest screamed in response. The spirits dissolved into mist, and the priest's form shattered like a wave crashing against rocks, dissipating with a final anguished cry. Silence fell, broken only by the ragged breaths of the crew. Jack stood with the chalice held high, the weight of its power thrumming in his veins, cold and relentless. The runes on the chart dimmed, their light merging with that of the cup. He looked down at Marta and Drake, their eyes wide, faces marked by disbelief and awe. "Captain," Marta's voice was cautious, hesitant. "What have we done?" Jack lowered the cup, eyes dark with understanding. "We've claimed the sea's power and now it claims us. This is only the beginning." As the crew regained their footing, a distant rumble rolled through the earth, a warning from the sea itself. The forest seemed to sigh, the silver leaves trembling as if to whisper, "Beware." From the far side of the island, the horizon darkened, clouds churning with a ferocity that promised the arrival of something more formidable than any storm they had ever faced. The sea had given its power, but it would demand more than just their loyalty in return. The sky darkened with a suddenness that turned day to night, as if the heavens themselves recoiled from the power now pulsing in Jack's grasp. The wind howled, carrying with it the bitter tang of salt, and the distant roar of waves that pounded against the shore like war drums. The crew of the Amber Dagger stood frozen in the clearing, eyes locked on their captain as a chill more biting than any storm swept through their bones. "Captain, we need to leave. Now," Marta urged, the confidence in her voice eroding under the weight of an unseen dread. Even Drake, a man whose resolve was as steady as a ship's anchor, shifted uneasily, his fingers tightening around his cutlass. Jack stared at the chalice in his hand, its light dulling as if withdrawing now that its power had been claimed. Yet, a distant rumble, low and resonant, reminded him that the sea would not be so easily tamed. The air crackled with the warning of an ancient force awakening, a force that would come not with chains, but with the fury of a realm wronged. "The cup of tides is ours, but the sea won't relinquish it without a fight," Jack said, his voice steady yet laced with a hint of grim understanding. He met Marta's gaze, the unspoken question clear between them. Was it worth it? A sudden roar shattered the stillness, and from the forest edge the ground erupted in a spray of sand and seawater. A creature emerged, massive and scaled, with eyes like molten gold that reflected the chaos of the storm beyond. It was a being pulled from legends, half serpent, half wave, crowned with jagged crystalline fins that shimmered with each heartbeat of the sea. "The Leviathan," Drake breathed, eyes wide as the monster coiled, its tail thrashing and leaving deep gouges in the earth. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of teeth as long as swords, and from its throat came a roar that sent the crew staggering back. "Defensive line!" Marta shouted, rallying the crew as they drew their weapons. But against this, blades seemed as useless as reeds in the wind. The creature lunged, its bulk crashing down with a force that splintered the altar and sent Jack sprawling. The chalice slipped from his grasp, skittering across the stones. For a heartbeat, the world stood still as Jack's eyes met the beast's, an intelligence behind the fury that burned brighter than the sun. "Captain, get up!" Marta screamed, her sword a useless sliver against the towering form. The Leviathan's eyes flicked to her, and it struck, tail sweeping with deadly grace. She dove, barely avoiding the blow, but the ground trembled beneath her. Jack's fingers scraped across the stones as he grabbed the chalice once more. The instant his skin touched it, the power roared back to life, and he felt the sea's command coil around his soul, tight as a noose. "Korath!" he shouted, voice splitting the sky. The beast paused, a flicker of recognition in its molten eyes. For a moment, the storm itself seemed to hesitate, the wind holding its breath. The crew stared, caught between hope and the realization that they stood on the knife's edge of something they could not comprehend. The Leviathan reared, towering above them as the runes on the chalice and chart blazed with a light so fierce, it turned night to day. The roar of the sea echoed back, not in anger, but in answer. The beast's eyes narrowed, not with rage, but with something almost like respect. Jack's voice broke the stillness. "By the power of the storm, I command you to yield." The Leviathan's golden eyes met his, and then, with a rumbling snarl, it lowered itself, coils relaxing as if acknowledging the right of command. The wind eased, the waves calmed, and the storm's fury stilled, leaving only the heavy sound of the crew's breath and the rustle of the silver-leafed trees. Marta rose, disbelief etched into her features. "Captain, did we just—" Jack nodded, his hand trembling as the power receded, leaving behind exhaustion that settled deep into his bones. Aye, but this was only the sea's first test. The Leviathan slipped back into the surf, its form disappearing beneath the waves, but the weight of its presence lingered like the ghost of a storm. The sky lightened, streaks of dawn clawing their way through the dark clouds. Drake sheathed his cutlass, eyes wary. "The sea let us live today, but it won't forget, Captain. We walk a line few have dared, and fewer have survived." Jack looked at the horizon, where the storm clouds gathered in the distance, not gone, but watching. The chalice in his hand felt heavier than ever, a symbol of power won, and a burden that would follow him to the end of the seas. He turned to his crew, their faces marked by awe, fear, and something more. Loyalty, tempered and forged by the shared trials of legend. "Prepare the ship," Jack ordered, a new resolve hardening his voice. "This is only the beginning. The sea may have chosen us, but it hasn't finished testing its captain." The Amber Dagger echoed with the rally of voices as the crew set to work. The air hummed with the promise of future glories and perils, each one darker and more thrilling than the last. And as the first light of dawn bathed the island in a golden glow, Jack knew that the true price of command was yet to be revealed. But he would face it, one wave at a time. Join Captain Jack and crew in future adventures as they uncover the mysteries of the sea's power, face new perils, and discover what it truly means to be chosen. If you enjoyed this tale, subscribe to You Pirate for more legendary adventures on the high seas. Don't miss the next chapter of treachery, myth, and power.